at this book, which we will read, and ask, how can we fit what he is saying here into a plausible overall interpretation of it? So what I will do is I will try to give you several alternative interpretations of it. I will also give you the interpretation that I think, for me, is most persuasive. I usually don't do that in philosophy classes. I don't usually let you know what my take on a particular issue is, or a particular philosopher, for that matter. But in this case, I really want to do that, not because I'm trying to just sort of propagandize and to manipulate you into believing the same way. I mean, how well you do in the test doesn't depend on whether you believe or I believe or not. It has to do entirely with understanding and being able to analyze what's in the book. But I think in order to do that, it's worthwhile to have at least several possible ways of sort of putting a template over the book and saying, okay, that's what this is going for. This is what he means by that. Because there are some things that just seem highly questionable, improbable, and inflammatory. And if you can't put them into context, you really won't know exactly how to take the book. Now, I'm not suggesting you assume the point of view that I hold. That's why I'm offering you several points of view. And as you read it, you can come to your own conclusion about what you think the book is about. You may differ with me, that's fine. You may agree with me, and that's fine too. It's more, I want you to at least have a series of options in front of you when you read the book and you start to make sense of it, to see maybe which option is the one that best organizes the book for you mentally and conceptually and helps you understand it better. And that's why I'm giving you these various options. So let's look at the different interpretations. I just have about 6 of them. Maybe 7 if I get pissed off. But of course I won't. I get Mr. Happy. But he's broken. Now I'm morose again. I'm becoming bipolar because of Mr. Happy. First I'm happy, now I'm devastated.
You should get some medication.
It's so sad. Okay, well, I'll try to make it through this. The first interpretation I'm calling Local Hero because it means absolutely nothing. Actually, there was a wonderful movie called Local Hero. It was from 1984, I think. So it's a movie well before you were born or anything like that, most of you, I guess. It was one of the last movies that Burt Lancaster was in. It's a wonderful, magical movie in which one of the stars of the movie is the Aurora Borealis. I mean, how can you not like a movie that has at least one of the starring roles, the Aurora Borealis? The other starring role is Scotland, the whole country of Scotland. It's a cool movie, wonderful movie. Funny, sexy, romantic, profound, and is called Local Hero. However, this has nothing to do with the Aurora Borealis. This has to do with the fact that Machiavelli saw himself as a patriot, and that's sort of a good starting point for this interpretation. The Italy that he was living in was not Italy as we know it today. It was not a country, really. It was a series of sort of municipalities or city-states, similar to Athens, Sparta, Thebes, as it was back in the time of Socrates. There were city-states, all of whom pretty much spoke Italian, but none of whom was really allied politically and sometimes not even militarily to each other. The problem with this is that within the European world, city-states were sort of passé. They were no longer around. There were big countries like Germany and France, and particularly France and Spain. France and Spain were big, powerful countries run by a king and somewhat rapacious countries looking to expand their territory, expand their source of products and raw materials. And so a lot of the city-states and the areas of Italy that were valuable were being taken over by Philip, King of Spain, one of the damn Louis or another of France. There were a whole lot of ways in which larger European countries were sort of sucking up the good parts of Italy. And Machiavelli, at least in part, I think this is a true interpretation. It's merely not a complete interpretation. Machiavelli was trying to inspire Italy to throw off the yoke of foreign invaders, to become a country, not just a series of squabbling states. And it was made worse by the popes, the various popes. One of the Borgias became a pope. I mean, anybody can become a pope, and then if you were lucky enough, you were happened to be the bastard son of a pope, you got to be pope too. Popes would sort of pass on the pretty hat to their kids often. And so, and popes were typically were generals. The pope is not some guy that stands on the balcony and waves to people and waits for the white smoke to come out of the chimney. He's a guy that puts on armor and goes out and kicks ass. The popes had armies, the popes were generals, and the popes were sort of big princes in some sort of a way. So that, and plus it also had the power of heaven and hell, dispensation, stuff of that sort. So there, a lot of what was happening in Italy was an attempt to sort of rein in the power of the popes, because a lot of people didn't think we needed an Italy run by the Pope. We needed an Italy run by some sort of a civil government, but there were too many civil governments, the one in Florence, and the one in Naples, and the one in Milan, and the one, wherever it would be. There were different places that had sort of civil governments. So the local hero interpretation is the interpretation that what he was trying to do is to inspire people and sort of inspire, isn't there a prince among us? Isn't there someone in Italy who can take over the role of uniting the country and driving out the invaders? And so here's my advice. If you're the prince, if you're the one we're looking for, someday my prince will, you know, that kind of thing. If you're the one we're waiting for, here's a handbook, here's a manual, all ready for you to use to drive out these people who are sort of turning us into just a serfdom rather than a country. So the local hero aspect is one where he, Machiavelli, the patriot, and he was a patriot. He was deeply committed to his country and greatly desired it to be set free. In the last chapter, chapter 26, we won't read 26 because it's nothing more than a plea, you know, show off, you know, let's throw off our yoke, throw off our chains from foreign invaders and take over our country, that kind of a thing. So he was certainly attempting to, at least in part, he certainly was trying to be a reformer to take Italy back for the Italians. But is that the whole interpretation? I think not. I think that's only, let's say, a sidebar to the interpretation. So what else do we have? One. When we look at all of the horrible things that he is advising you to do, you know, kill them all is sort of one of his favorite phrases, you know. When in doubt, kill them all. I think that is going to be one of his favorite phrases, for those of you who wonder. Some people have read this as him writing a cautionary tale, warning us that if you give anyone this kind of complete power, this is what they're likely to do with it. So it's in some sense a warning, which is very, very funny. If you look at the local hero aspects, it is, here, Prince, here's what you ought to do. But this interpretation is almost the opposite, saying, here, Prince, good dog. No, it's here, Prince, and be careful, this is what a prince is going to do if we let him have complete power. So the local hero interpretation says, let's find a good prince and give him all the power to do all this stuff. The second one says, this is what happens when you give a prince a whole bunch of power. You're going to get your ass handed to you. So we have two rather different interpretations. And in fact, there's an offshoot of the second one I'll sort of put in here. We'll call it the satire interpretation, which is that we shouldn't take the book seriously. I mean, the caution against tyrants is a serious warning. If this is what is likely to happen if we give people sort of unparalleled power. This is sort of doing it in a sarcastic way, sort of saying the same thing, but doing it and being sarcastic and being satirical. And you'll find some funny stuff. I find a lot of funny stuff in Machiavelli in reading it. He did have sort of a sly and cynical sense of humor, and so I sort of like it. But in addition, that would certainly support the satire interpretation. So it would be still a caution against tyrants, but there is either the serious or the sarcastic view of the caution against tyrants. But even the satire would be, in fact, a caution against tyrants. Let's see, what else do we have here? You know, we've got another that we'll call the anti-Christian morality. Now, not anti the church, not anti-Christ or anything of that sort. But the view of a lot of people is that the very thing that Machiavelli is advising goes totally contrary to Christian morality. The Christian morality, that of loving your neighbor, of turning the other cheek, of giving to the poor, of giving of yourself, and all the kinds of things that Jesus was an example of in the Gospels. The argument is what Machiavelli is suggesting, that that's the worst possible thing you can do. And if you're a prince, you're stupid if you're a Christian. Or at least you're stupid if you are going to adhere to Christian morality. That if you want to send your country down the tubes real fast, be a prince who is really serious about his religion. That sort of is the view that this group of people, the people who interpret it as anti-Christian morality, as essentially a slam on the moral basis of Christianity. That he is saying that's the worst thing you can do, and you're a sap if you're a prince and you're going to be a Christian. You're also going to be an ex-prince real fast. And so that's one view. This is a view that comes up continually, even to this very day. Remember, the book's been around for 500 years. So it has been 500 years for people to get their, get a lather about it. And in a lot of, particularly in Catholic institutions, of higher education, this is a predominant view. A lot of academics see Machiavelli as deliberately trying to trash Christian morality and essentially turn back the clock to paganism, turn back the clock to almost no morality at all, or let's say might makes right kind of morality. If you can get away with it, it's right. If you didn't get away with it, then it wasn't right, and you're dead, so who cares? So that's a way of looking at it. Now, certainly Machiavelli does pay lip service to religion, to Christianity there in The Prince. You'll see, he will say, first of all, it's very important for a prince to, not to be religious, but appear to be religious. Particularly in a religious country. One of the most important things you can do is to seem to be religious, to make all the show of being religious. But he doesn't say anything about, and be sure to be religious in private. No, his view is that you need to have the support of the people at a certain level. And one way you can get the support of the people is to appear to be pious, to hold your Bible in your hand, and go to church every Sunday, and do all those kinds of things that are felt to be indicative in some sort of a symbolic form of having also the moral fiber of a Christian. Now, don't actually do it, says him, but he says you need to appear to do it. So to be an effective hypocrite is one good thing to be a prince. That's what this interpretation is sort of keying on, the idea that by saying a prince has to be an effective hypocrite, it's merely saying that Christian morality is useless, it's worthless, its time is up, get it out of here. So again, that's one interpretation. I think with each of these interpretations, I can find a kernel of truth in the sense of, yeah, he really does not think that a prince will be effective if he attempts to literally live a Christian life for his people. That would be a bad idea. And one could argue that both of these are true. One, that he is a funny sort of a guy at times. And second of all, he can't help but recognize that his writing can be viewed as extreme. And therefore, if it's viewed as extreme, it could be seen equally effectively as a warning as for an advice. Probably nowadays, the most prominent interpretation, the one that sort of is popular. First of all, I'm going to put, as I said, about 5 or 6 up here. And of these 5 or 6, there is no one that has a majority vote. The vote is split among so many people that there is maybe a plurality at best. And the plurality, I think, comes with the next one. I don't know about numbers here, so I'm just putting them up here. And this would be the cold technician interpretation. This is the view that all Machiavelli is writing about is, let's say, technical advice without any moral justification or anything. He's not trying to destroy morality. He's not trying to promote morality. He doesn't give a damn about morality. He's just giving advice to, this is what you got to do to hold power. This is what you have to do to obtain power. This is what you got to do to get rid of the people who might be challenges to your power. And it's not a matter of this is the right thing or the wrong thing. It's a matter of this is the expeditious thing. This is the effective thing. This is what will get the job done. And there's nothing about anything like it's the good thing to do or it's the right thing to do. It's the effective thing to do. It's the efficient thing to do. And so the cold technician is an interpretation that's pretty popular today. And there have been people, I'll just mention one in American history, recent American history, he's still alive today, who is often called Machiavellian. Now, some people also think of Dick Cheney as Machiavellian. I'm going back a little farther in history. I wouldn't argue against the Dick Cheney hypothesis, however. But the person I'm thinking about is Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was, I found out in my 9 o'clock class, I had to tell everybody who Nixon was. So I'm sure, have any of you ever heard of this man named Nixon? Not Jay Nixon, but actually there was a president, actually I had to tell him about Bill Clinton, who they didn't seem to know that he was president of the United States. So anyway, yeah, the Bill Clinton thing was about the anti-Christian morality, the idea of being a hypocrite. Not that Bill Clinton is a hypocrite, or is he? But the view, remember Clinton, oh, you don't have okay. Clinton was a president of the United States back before any of you was born, back in the 1990s. And he was once, when he was campaigning, confronted with something like, had he smoked dope when he was in college or something of that sort. And apparently he said, yes, I had been given a marijuana cigarette, I think he called it, but he didn't inhale. And so that's sort of the anti-Christian morality view of the prince. You can take the communion, but don't eat it, or you can, don't inhale, don't actually believe it, just sort of put on a show for it. So that's where the Clinton thing came up. And then, I helped teach history occasionally, I guess, teaching people that there was a president named Clinton. Now, there was also a president named Nixon, elected in 1968, inaugurated in 69, forced out of office in 1974, I believe. At any rate, his Secretary of State eventually was Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was an expatriate who came from Germany after the Second World War and taught at Harvard and was a great, very popular teacher of government and political science at Harvard, and eventually got into government. And he was also National Security Advisor. I think he was National Security Advisor first for Nixon, and then became the Secretary of State at a certain time. And so he was called Machiavellian. He's one of the most famous Americans to be called Machiavellian. And it was sort of the cold technician version of Machiavellian. The idea was that power is its own excuse. Power is its own justification. So you do whatever you got to do to keep power and to keep people from getting power from you. This is during the Vietnam War, when he apparently advised and produced a lot of policies that were thought to be somewhat reprehensible. But for him, the thing is, American power needs to be accrued, demonstrated, defended, and whatever we do in the name of power is right. It's just, rightness has to do with keeping power. So that's sort of, yeah.
Wasn't he given the Nobel Peace Prize along with the leader of...
He sure enough was, along with Lee Duc-Tho.
Yeah.
Lee Duc-Tho. Duc-Tho, Lee with it.
Did he reject it though? Lee Duc-Tho rejected it. He said he wasn't gonna...
Yeah, Lee Duc-Tho rejected it because he has a conscience.
Yeah.
Kissinger will take anything, if it's on his mantle. Sure. So if we wanted to have a collection, send Kissinger a cold technician medal or something, we could do that. But he did win. Well, I guess you have to call it winning. And he would call it winning, right? Because it's all about getting whatever you can get. So the cold technician interpretation is probably among the most popular ones today. Seeing Machiavelli as giving nothing more than advice concerning power, but thinking that power needs no moral justification. The use of power never needs moral justification, never needs any kind of a justification. The justification of power is, do you keep it, do you enlarge it, do you strengthen it? That's the only thing. Everything else is bullshit. That would be sort of the cold technician view. Well, isn't there a warm, fuzzy Machiavelli somewhere in these pages? Yes, there is, if I got anything to say about it. Because I'm warm, fuzzy, too. I know, you can't believe it about either one of us, can you? Well, it's probably more true about me than about Machiavelli, but let's give you a warm, fuzzy interpretation. This is going to be, I'll call it the anguished humanist interpretation. Now, the anguished humanist interpretation says that, and this came from the early 20th century philosopher, Italian philosopher, Benedetto Croce. Croce is a great philosopher, now pretty much in eclipse. Of course, he's dead for many decades, but he was one of the great philosophers of art and of aesthetics. His work on aesthetics, called Aesthetic, is one of the great, I think, one of the great works on philosophy of art ever written. But times have sort of passed him by. But in his most prominent time, around 1910, 1920, when he wrote let's say, in support of Machiavelli. Machiavelli, once the 20th century came in and we had the First World War and all of its atrocities and all its pig-headed and all of its just senseless loss of life, and then moving on to the totalitarianism of fascism and Nazism, there was a lot of sort of looking back to Machiavelli and either saying, if you happen to be a fascist or a Nazi, hey, this is some good ideas. Or if you happen to be opposing them, saying, hey, Machiavelli predicted it all along, and we got to live with it. The anguished humanist view is that Machiavelli recognized that sometimes you got to get your hands dirty if you're ruling. You got to do some things that you wouldn't ordinarily do. But he saw Machiavelli as somehow conscience-stricken by having to do it. He gives this advice, you've got to kill all these people, but then he has, the Croce's interpretation is that he feels bad the whole time. It's sort of this hurts me more than it hurts you kind of a thing. And so he saw Machiavelli as knowing that the only effective way to use power is to use it this way, but almost not forgiving himself for having to give this kind of advice. He has to give the advice because he has to be honest, but his heart is torn up inside because he loves humanity, basically, and he wants humanity to flourish, and yes, he is inviting princes to go in for wholesale slaughter and pillage. So this is sort of a nice sort of a revisionist kind of interpretation. The anguished humanist, poor Machiavelli, sort of a bipolar kind of a situation. Well, what's my point of view? Not that you asked. It's shame on you for not asking. Well, first of all, my point of view is I got to find another marker. I mean, this thing, I have other things to it. So I'll be back. Stay away from Mr. Happy. I saw you had your eye on Mr. Happy.
I read it like in middle school, and my AP lit class.
Snatched it right out of a teacher's hand.
Did you punch him first?
Huh?
Did you punch him first? That was kind of awesome.
And
Right in the middle of
a
his
big
leg.
sucker, too.
Supplies, closet. He has a green marker sitting right there.
Hey, don't ruin the image. I can imagine him leaping into the class, punching a teacher, grabbing, running out.
Those ones don't count anyway, right?
to try to talk about, should I wait? Should you all take a break? Is that, did I sort of
She got it.
give permission for a break? We get people going out stage. Let's quickly cover a whole lot of test questions while we're gone. In order to explain a point of view, I think, to me, is a compelling interpretation, I want to go back to Socrates. I thought that would be good in another way, because it helps us sort of link Socrates, who you just spent far too much time with, I guess you would probably say, and Machiavelli, with whom you'll spend far too little time. So, and the way we're going to connect them is through something very important to Socrates. You might wonder, how can this be important to Machiavelli? Let's see. It's called virtue. Virtue was certainly important to Socrates. Virtue was, if we think of it as his moral scruples, his desire to be the best person he can be, to live up to his values, to stand by them, and to be fearless, to live and act according to what's right. You can think of that as sort of virtue. And so let's make Socrates a poster here for virtue. So, because we already know about virtue with Socrates, we also know that he saw the root to virtue as being rational. The way you become virtuous is to understand in a rational way what's true and what's not true, what is consistent with your well-being, what is not consistent, those kinds of things. And so, in addition, however, there is one other strain in Socratic style, is sort of that he was pretty much an idealist. And if you look at his behavior in the trial, that's almost all you need to know. He was a person who really wasn't trying to do the practical thing of get off those charges. He was out there trying to prove his virtue to everyone, and not in a practical way, in a very idealistic way. So that if we see these as elements of what we already read about in Socrates, that he believed in virtue, and he believed that rationality was the root to virtue, and that in some sense, no matter the practical implications, you live according to virtue, and in some sense, this idealistic, I'll sacrifice my life rather than do a bad thing, is pretty damned idealistic. I try to promote it as a wonderful thing, and I'm not saying it's not wonderful, but I do think it's pretty damn sort of idealistic. Socrates, let's say, but in the legacy of Socrates, we have, and I'm running out of board already. Where can I go? Okay, that's well. Okay, I've got an idea of what to do. Within the legacy of Socrates, and we'll put idealism and rationality, it's sort of all bundled in there together to be included. Within the legacy of Socrates, however, we have two different kinds of virtue relevant to this discussion. We have individual virtue, and that's sort of what we got mostly about concerning the apology and other things. His work within Athens was about trying to have individuals develop their own virtue, develop their own character, and know right from wrong, know true from false, know these kinds of things. So within the Socratic life, there was pretty much a complete emphasis on individual virtue. Now, if you remember Professor Smith, he talked a little bit about sort of the civic virtue and different kinds of things of that sort, and where Socrates stood on that. There is something else about civic virtue, however, that I wanted to bring out. That within, let's say, the legacy of Socrates, and I'm talking now about Plato, so civic virtue becomes a very, very important topic. So I'll put Plato here just in brackets here, because this is really an important person to be uncovering, if not Socratic views on civic virtue, views that were sort of descendants of Socrates about the idealism and the rationality of virtue. And within civic virtue, there really are two different models. Now, the Platonic model is, let's call it the secular model. And that comes out through his work, The Republic, and other works too, but Republic is the most important one. And that there we have a secular model, a model just based upon reason and ideals and having nothing to do with any kind of religious template at all being imposed upon society. So that if we now sort of trace back the idea of virtue, civic virtue, secular style, is essentially the kind of virtue that Plato felt from in the Republic, that Plato felt was the goal of society. The goal of political society was fundamentally to make good citizens, to make citizens virtuous. And in Republic, in that great work, he developed sort of a game plan, a plan for all of society, which, if followed, would end up with the result of having virtuous citizens. So the goal even within civic virtue, is always about making virtuous individual citizens. And it is an idealistic view. Anybody who's read The Republic will realize that it's sort of is a pie-in-the-sky kind of a view of what society can be, but that's Plato and Socrates' idealism, and it's also worked out in a very rational, systematic, logical way, so that virtue on the Socratic/Platonic side has its most important expression, let's say, in Republic. But I've left a little something here dangling, and that is the sacred side. Now, the sacred side doesn't have really to do with Plato. Plato really had no real religious action line, so we'll make sure we have Plato here with the Republic. But there is in this model, in this rationalistic, idealistic model, a version of, a sacred version of trying to establish a community for the purpose of making people virtuous on a religious framework, not on a secular framework, but to use religion as sort of the main tool that will help people become virtuous. This is a model of Augustine, and The City of God was the famous book he wrote. Very big, cumbersome book. Augustine is the author of it. And he is setting up sort of exactly what Plato was setting up in the Republic, an idea that if we structure a city around particular religious principles and idealistic principles and rational principles, we can end up making people virtuous and holy and pious. We can produce God's city, in which it's not just God's city, but it's a city in which each individual person is encouraged and drawn, or maybe driven, to be religious at a high level of effectiveness. So that virtue is sort of where we're going to start, and virtue has, we now see sort of is trickling into the medieval time. Machiavelli is part of the medieval time. So, is he going to be a part of the Socratic tradition? The answer is not only no, but hell no. He is the antithesis of the Socratic tradition. And the connection between Machiavelli and Socrates is a disconnection. I think the fact that we knew something about Socrates made it useful for me to remind us about some of the aspects of Socratic thought. But now it's important to say, this ain't anything like Socrates. But what is it like if it's not about Socrates? And is there any model for the views of Machiavelli that come out of the ancient world? Why, yes, there is. Red state, blue state, okay? Well, Aristotle. Aristotle had a view, yeah.
I was just saying, Aristotle was the pragmatist, wasn't he? Like
He was a what?
a pragmatist. That was
Yeah, very much so. And that's sort of where this is sort of what I end up with. But yeah, he was a pragmatist, certainly not an idealist. I have to certainly say that. And though he was certainly rational, he used his rationality for what he thought were practical, pragmatic ends rather than idealistic, wouldn't it be wonderful if the world were like this kinds of ends. So Aristotle is the person we look to in the ancient world for something of a lineage that leads us down to Machiavelli. I'll try to make that connection, and then I'll try to, by making that connection, give you an idea of the interpretation of the Prince that I think is most persuasive. An important word, it's a word that will be in your book in Machiavelli, that is also in Aristotle, is the Italian word virtue. Virtue in Aristotle often is this meaning of virtue. Virtue is the use of the word virtue in a more practical sense. For instance, what Aristotle often would say, having to do with his view of the world, that everything is created for some purpose. And when it does its purpose well, then it is at its highest level of development. And doing it well is called having that virtue. So the virtue of a knife is to cut, and to cut sharply and deeply, or whatever it is. I may have mentioned this before, some ceramic kitchen knives at home, and perpetual scars on my left hand as I find that these are pretty damn sharp knives. These are virtuous knives. Virtue in this sense means being able to fulfill its purpose to the highest level of efficiency. So that's what virtue is. Now that has nothing to do with the Socratic virtue, which has all to do with moral qualities. Virtue in Aristotelian terms has nothing to do with morality per se. He wrote some morality, and I'll talk about it in a bit, but mainly when he's talking about when you evaluate something, you're not evaluating it fundamentally on moral terms. You're evaluating on more or less on affective terms. He did write a couple of things about virtue, about civic virtue, and about individual virtue. About individual virtue, he wrote what's called the Nicomachean Ethics, and about civic virtue, he wrote a book called The Politics. And these, in fact, one way I like to sort of point to these is to do this. What I mean by that is, in writing the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle described how you become a good person, but how you become a good person within the context of a political community. And that your best goal as a person is to work effectively within your community, within your political community. The idea of individualism, the kind of individualism that someone like Socrates, who is willing to say, piss on all the, and I don't like your damn city either, actually he did, but he's sort of the idea that I'll stand alone if I have to, and be opposed to all of you, is something that would be utterly alien to Aristotle. Something has gone wrong if this is what you do. Socrates stands proudly alone and flipping off the jury. Aristotle would say, you've got to work together here and find some way to deal with it, because something has gone terribly wrong if there's this one person standing against everybody, and this one person thinks he's doing the right thing. The Nicomachean Ethics, the individualistic ethics, in fact, ends in sort of the last chapter referring to, the only thing we got to explain now is how to act right in the context of a political community. And he says for that, let's go to the book on politics. He wrote, and the book on politics is quite a wonderful book, in which he tried to explain the kinds of political organization that, first of all, will permit you to be virtuous, and let's say, permit you to be a good person, but also make certain you recognize that being a good person is not sort of an unentangled situation. It's a situation where you have obligations to the city. This sort of came out a little bit in Crito, where the laws talking to Socrates, and there's enough of a hint of that you maybe can remember that the laws reminds him that you can't harm people and you got to stick to your agreements. Well, that was sort of an ancient Greek idea of your relation to the city-state. With Aristotle, it was much stronger than that everything that you learn here is something that's applicable here. And that insofar as you think that your individual virtue, your individual morality is something that you can exercise on a desert island he would say, no, everything you do is based upon your doing it within a community. And here's how we organize a community so that you make your highest contribution to the community. And in fulfilling your contribution to the community, you fulfill yourself and you fulfill the community. You strengthen the community, you become a better person yourself. You can't be isolated from, you cannot thumb your nose at, and you cannot absent yourself from a community. You have to be everyone. He says that at the very beginning of the politics. One of his, he often begins his books with these great one-line quotes, which he then works on for the rest of the book. And what he says in this is that human beings are in their very nature, he called them political animals. Animals are people who need to be within some sort of a regulated arena of other people in order to fulfill, to flourish themselves. I mean, the Nicomachean ethics, the individualistic ethics, was all about flourishing. But flourishing can only occur within a context in which your flourishing is both appreciated and improves the community, and you're improved by the feedback from the community. So that for Aristotle, the prime virtue, let's say in a moral sense, was the good of the community. The good of the community is what you aim for, whether you know it or not. Maybe in your reading of ethics, you would say, well, this is all just about me, but you go all the way through at the end, you realize it's not all about me. It's all about what can I do to make my community a better place, and then it will make me a better person as well. The reciprocity of the two is.
Was Aristotle a Stoic? Stoic. Aristotle.
Was he a Stoic?
Yeah.
No.
Okay. I was like,
No.
but he learned from, he was Socrates, like a student of Socrates, or Plato, a student.
Yeah, he learned from Plato, but he didn't hate
Yeah.
Plato. But Plato, he just argued over at very different points of view. He was far from an idealist. He was much more, let's say, an empiricist, a person who said, let's study the way things are, and that's the way we'll be able to understand the world is, the way the world is. And for Plato, it was all, let's think about things, and that'll tell us how the world is. Aristotle was look and figure it out. Plato was think and figure it out. So, where do we get Machiavelli? We get Machiavelli from here. Beep, 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 beep. My view of Machiavelli is that he is something like Aristotelian in the sense that he views the highest good within, let's say, a political organization as the good of the community, the good of the country, the good of whatever the largest viable political organization is. In the time of Machiavelli running the Prince, it was these city-states, places like Florence, Naples, Milan, those kinds of places would be, let's say, that it's the good of them, the good in the sense of doing everything to protect and defend and to enhance life within that place. And that's what everything should be aimed at. So the view often over here, even within something like Augustine or in the Republic, the view is always to make people better. It's still always sort of, the individualism always sneaks back in. The purpose of the Republic is to make individuals virtuous in a secular way. The purpose of the city of God to make people holy, to make people, as an individual person, pious and God-fearing. For Machiavelli, it's not about the individuals within society, within the political unit. It's about the strength of the political unit itself. But he saw it, if we're going to say that with the Socratic, Platonic view, that from a good city come good citizens, he sees it the other way around. It's not the goal of the city to make good citizens. It's the goal of citizens to make a good city. And that was also fundamentally the view of Aristotle. Now, he takes it to a greater extent, because he recognizes that to a certain, and in his time, citizens aren't going to make the city. It's in the time of Aristotle and Plato, the democracies of ancient Athens, it was thought that the people would have to be the ones who would end up being the ones to make or break the viability of the city.
So
By the
would you
time
switch?
of Aristotle, by the time of Machiavelli, while there was a great movement, what's called a Republican movement, and his discourses, a book he wrote after he wrote The Prince, in his discourses he talks about the beauties of self-determination, what he called the Republican life, not the Karl Rove life, but the life within a republic. But he recognized that for the time being, it's going to be single person, one man, strong man leaders that are going to run, particularly Italy, and probably a lot of other world, because he also had the kings in various countries of Europe. And so, however the viability of the unit is going to be taken care of, it's going to be taken care of by princes, by leaders, by strong people, by rulers. And so, the prince, I take it to be pretty much a handbook, and this is not just my own personal view, but other people hold this view as well, that the prince is a way of setting up not just the practical application of putting the city first, but also giving almost an argument in one way or another for this point of view. And so I see his view, I see the prince as a moral book, as having strict and absolutely unbreakable standards, but the morality is not individual morality. It's the morality of the strength of the city and the beauty of the city and the greatness of the city. For him, morality had often to do with greatness, particularly among leaders. Just to be, he'll talk about the difference between power and greatness, and power doesn't always get you greatness. And power can be misused, and you never end up being great, and you're a disgrace to the power you have. So his view, I believe, again, this is my point of view, is that a prince has obligations to the well-being of the city. And sometimes, to fulfill those obligations, he has to do things which are different from what, let's say, a good individual would do in, let's say, relations to a neighbor, relations to family members, etc. And his point of view is you have to divorce these two moral systems. You divorce this personal, Christian, individualistic, pietistic view and say that has no place in the world of the community. The community, you have to discover what's right or wrong for the community. You can't just graft on Christian values to a community and expect the community to be anything other than hapless. And so he says, put them aside. In fact, he sort of hints at one time that if you want to stick to your Christian values, fine. No one's going to stop you from doing that. Just stay out of the White House. Stay out of the halls of power. Stay off the throne. You will be a liability. You have obligations to people who are depending upon you to make the right decision. And conventional morality will inevitably lead you to the wrong decision, and then you'll be betraying the people who depend upon you, who have no voice other than the voice of please don't do that, you imbecile. And if they have no voice and yet they're being led in the wrong way, it's a horrible thing. So his view is put your ordinary views of morality aside, put them in a closet and leave them there. If you're going to be a prince, if you aspire to power, put them behind you forever. Now, with a fresh sheet of paper, we ask, what obligations does a prince have, assuming that the ultimate values of the prince are to preserve and protect and defend the country he is in charge of. Work out them, and he works it out. That's what he's doing here in The Prince. He's not just giving practical advice. I think he's giving moral advice, saying, here are the values that you need to see as relevant, and keep away from those other values, because those values, unless they can prove their relevance, will be toxic. The individualistic, and in his case, mostly Christian, values that were around in his time, he just thought, you can't bring them into the places of power, or you have betrayed those who depend upon you. So that's my view of what we're going to be looking for. You may have very, very different view, and that's fine. I'm happy with you having a different point of view. But I don't think he was an immoralist. If he was anti-Christian morality, he was not against Christian morality per se. He thought that maybe as an individual, sitting in your thatched hut and not doing anything other than whatever you do in the whole, that's tough. That's fine. He's not saying outlaw Christian morality. He is saying that it is a betrayal of your obligations to bring it into the seat of power. You have to understand what obligations you have and what values they sort of point to and live according to that. He is trying to develop them in the Prince, and they will sound horrible. They will sound often as if they're betraying what everyone holds to be true and right and good. And he would say, so, the important thing is that you have obligations as a prince to do more than satisfy your own conscience. You have a country to run. And other people who have no power and have no voice depend on you to do it, to keep them in food, to keep them from being attacked and marauded. And if you don't do it, then because you're satisfying your own puny little conscience, then you deserve to have your head rolling down the street somewhere with the rest of your body somewhere else. So that's my cheery, Mr. Happy interpretation. I happen to think it's a one that can be defended. I'll try to, I think that each of the ones I put on the board has, like I said, a kernel to it. But this is the general, not the kernel. No damn bird kernel. This is a full star. Okay. Yes?
Are you an idealist or realist?
Am I an idealist or a realist? I'm a idealist. Now, I would say, for the purposes of understanding the Prince, I'm a realist. It doesn't mean that I am 100%. I think one thing you find about most philosophers, other than the people that get the names of books like that, most philosophers tend to be much more complex and much more fluid than the hardcore, is this way or the highway kind of person. I mean, Plato was a this way or the highway kind of guy. He's a whole lot more important than I am. But I do think that in that, he has so many blind spots. And what Machiavelli is trying to do, this is what I think being a practical person as a philosopher does, what Machiavelli is trying to do is saying, you can't afford to have those kinds of massive blind spots if you're leading a country. Because massive blind spots leads to massive starvations. Think of something like the idealism of Chairman Mao. You know, I have Chairman Mao crap all around me. I'm not a fan of Chairman Mao. I got a free wallet with his ugly face on it. I'm not a fan of Chairman Mao. I just happen to think it's sort of grotesque the way he is turned into an advertising icon by his own people. I think it's one of the most funny things I've seen in recent history. But he was a horrible person. And people like Stalin was the same sort of way. Take an ideology. There was I'll use the Stalin example because you probably hadn't heard much of him. You've heard of sometime of Chairman Mao. Stalin, the view of Soviet Marxist Leninist agriculture, which you might think, why would there be a Marxist Leninist view of agriculture? Well, the whole view of it was that genetics are nothing, and everything is environment. And so you can coax or force even crops to grow in a particular way if you give them the proper environment. It doesn't really matter if they're not genetically suited. All you have to do is create the right environment. So they were anti-genetics because genetics was something like determinism, and they didn't believe in determinism. They believed we could freely change the world, kind of a thing. And so Stalin in the 1930s assigned a man who was a third-rate geneticist and agronomist named T.D. Lysenko to run the whole agricultural program based upon pure communist principles. Well, running the agricultural program means particularly running the wheat program every spring, which is where the great amount of wheat for Soviet Union at that time was grown. And so he started programs that were as soon as people in the West heard about it, they said, don't do this shit. You are going to destroy the crop. It'll never grow. And they wouldn't listen. These are these revisionist Westerners. They don't know what we're talking about. We know because Marx and Lenin told us this is the way to do it. And so they just destroyed the wheat crop for years and years. Millions of people starved to death because they didn't have food, mainly because the food was being, or the agriculture was being directed by essentially an idealist. An idealist in the worst sense of the word. Someone who is, I'd say, an ideologue would be a better way of saying it. Someone who says, we have the true word, this is, the word from on high, therefore this is the way we must do it to be pure to our great Marxist values, and in return destroyed everything. Same thing happened with the great famines in 1958 and 59 and 60 in China, same sort of thing. And in the Cultural Revolution in 68 and the years around that, same kind of thing. Idealism, which says this is the way we must do it, typically has so many blind spots that it takes only a true ideologue to run the program, and then the blind spots come up and bite them in the ass. I mean, the bite marks on Chairman Mao's ass probably went with him to the grave.
He did the Great Leap the Great Leap Forward.
Yeah, the Great Leap Forward was really, great. If you call a Great Leap Forward the death of millions of your citizens. Yeah, he thought he could bypass development and just go from the idea of serfdom to modern life, and of course it all just fell. Yeah.
Can I
so
clarify, going back, so Socrates thought that the city made the people better, good people made a good city, and Machiavelli thought that good people made a good city?
Yeah, the good people, people that make the city. And
So
more
it's
importantly,
not
that the
cities.
goal of everything, individual development, et cetera, is to have a better city. With Socrates, the goal of everything is to make people better,
Cities.
individually. And the city can be used as a tool, an environment within which people can become better people. With Aristotle, and to a certain extent with Machiavelli, sort of remodernized, the view is, no matter how good you are as a person, your goal is to make your city better. And then Aristotle believed it would be reciprocal, that, but you have to sort of be the person who brings to the city your own best self. And you will make the city better, and a better city will enhance your own life and enhance your own flourishing. But it's always do it for the good of the city. Like John McCain, country first.